Okay, once again, thank you guys for coming out. And for those tuning in online, our verses again are Genesis 48, 1 through 2, and then 8 through 22. And then Genesis 50, verses 22 and through 26. So it reads, verse 1, Now it came to pass after these things that Joseph was told, Indeed, your father is sick. And he took with him his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And Jacob was told, Look, your son Joseph is coming to you. And Israel strengthened himself and sat up in his bed. And then skipping on to verse 8. Then Israel saw Joseph's sons and said, Who are these? Joseph said to his father, These are my sons, whom God has given me in this place. And he said, Please bring them to me, and I will bless them. Now the eyes of Israel were dim with age, so that he could not see. Then Joseph brought them near him, and he kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, I'll do that. And Israel said to Joseph, I had not thought to see your face, but in fact God has also shown me your offspring. So Joseph brought them from beside his knees, and he bowed down with his face to the earth. Joseph took them both, Ephraim with his right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh with his left hand toward Israel's right hand, and brought them near to him. Then Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on Ephraim's head, who was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, guiding his hands knowingly, for Manasseh was the firstborn. And he blessed Joseph and said, God, before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has fed me all my life long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the lands, that my name be upon them, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. Now when Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him, so he took hold of his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, Not so, my father, for this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head. But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great, but truly his younger brother shall be greater than he. And his descendants shall become a multitude of nations. So he blessed them that day, saying, By you Israel will bless, saying, My God make you as Ephraim and Manasseh. And thus he set Ephraim before Manasseh. Then Israel said to Joseph, Behold, I am dying, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given you one portion above your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorite with my sword and my bow. And jumping over to Genesis 50, this is, for some context, I skipped the chapter where years later, Jacob is really on his deathbed. Like, he's sick at this point, but the next chapter he's dying, and so he brings all of his sons and blesses them all. And I do recommend you read it if you're curious, because it has some very cool prophecy, especially when he gets to Judah, because it's all about Jesus. Yes, Genesis 50, verse 22. So Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the third generation. The children of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were also brought up on Joseph's knees. And Joseph said to his brethren, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Okay, so any observations? Thoughts? Yep.
First thing I see here is closure for Jacob.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how many years Joseph closure to Jacob that Joseph didn't die by a wild animal.
Yeah, in a way, it's really cool, because, you know, if you look at it from Jacob's perspective, God kind of took what was most precious to him. He took Joseph away for a time.
Yeah.
And so to bring not only Joseph back, but to let him see Joseph's offspring, I think is, like you said, definitely closure for Jacob.
And Joseph had been successful in his life. His life wasn't wasted. He grew up in a state of being resourceful as well as useful to another country.
Yeah. Yeah, and ended up saving his whole family too. So
Yeah.
that's pretty
Plus the
cool.
rest of the known world at that time.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I like how it came around, you know, if you go back and you listen to the story of Jacob, now how he ended up getting the blessing as the younger.
Yeah.
And then now he's blessing Joseph's sons. And they thought he was doing, that he wasn't doing it right, and they tried to correct him. He's like, no.
Yeah.
You know, but that, you know, that God, in his kingdom, he doesn't do things the same as the world, you know?
Yeah, and I do think the whole thing is a little bit maybe ironic in a way, because, you know, like in Jacob's case, he took the birthright from his older brother, but he did it kind of a not so commendable way. But now in this case, now that he's much older and he's walking with the Lord much more, he's doing the same thing, but it's with God's leading. You know, I do think that God meant it to happen the way it did for Jacob in the beginning, that he got the birthright, because, you know, Esau was kind of an evil man, but I do think there could have been another way Jacob had went about it instead of deceiving his own dad, which
That's right.
I would feel pretty horrible about it. Yes, Al?
Well, he did the same thing with Ephraim that happened between him and Esau.
Right.
Because Esau was the firstborn there.
Yeah, exactly.
But Esau asked for what happened to him. It wasn't that they just took it away. He had no interest in the birthright. He sold it for
That's true,
a
yeah.
soup.
That's true, yeah. But I don't think that, because there was a birthright and then also the blessing, you know, the kind of inheritance.
Right.
And I do think that Esau still, you know, Isaac would have still blessed Esau with that. You know, he didn't know about the whole thing with the beans stew and everything. But God worked it out, I think, that Jacob got all of it because God's favor was on Jacob and he was going to work, you know, through Jacob and not Esau. But it is pretty interesting. It kind of reminds me of in previous studies when we looked at, like, I'm trying to blank on her name, but the harlot that saved the two spies, you know, she told a white lie. Yeah, she did a wrong thing to save them, but the end result was, you know, God still worked through it. It's not a commendable thing, but God used it for good anyway, which is interesting. But anyone else?
I read this several times over the last couple of weeks. I took the Lord gave me a completely different view of it. The example that Joseph lived his life for each and every one of us, even today. He never turned on God. Even in one of the scriptures that came to my mind, you are in this world, but not of this world. He was in Egypt, but he wasn't of Egypt. He always remained true to his Judeo upbringing, which led to one of the reasons, the tradition was the oldest son got the blessing from the birthright. So he was stopping his father. He still knew that at 100 and some years old or however old he was at the time.
Right.
So for me, as I read this several times, even again this morning, was that here's an example, once again, in the Old Testament that correlates to the example that Christ led us on this earth, that God knows what's best for us. We should not get in his way. And it's real easy to say that, and well, yeah, Joseph did it, and Jesus did it. Living in the world, as we all know here, is very difficult. But the example has been set before us that it can be done. God is faithful, and he will get us through. In Joseph's case, he died in that foreign land and wanted to make sure he got back to where his father's was.
Yeah.
To me, it was just exciting to see how that correlates with Jesus.
Yeah.
If we remain faithful, God will remain faithful too.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's kind of what the topic of the day is about. Today we're going over dreaming for the next generation. So, kind of as you were saying, even though Joseph wasn't able to go back to the promised land, he never saw it again, really. As we saw at the end of the text, and also Jacob said this too, God is going to bring you back. He will be with you, and so it's kind of like that passing on of God's promises, and what God said to me applies to your kids, That's right. But yeah, so in context of the whole study, Joseph, we kind of looked at as a dreamer, dreaming God's dream, and I think in many ways Jacob fits that too, even though most of the story doesn't look at Jacob. But now that he's kind of back in the scene, it's kind of interesting to see him interacting with Joseph. But, dreamers never stop dreaming even when they're going to die, even when they're on their deathbed. Both Jacob and Joseph didn't want to finish their time on earth without first imparting blessings to their offspring, and encouragement, really reminding them God is with you. And, I think see this not just in Joseph, but also later, say, with Joshua, when dreamers die, people who are really mightily used by God, they leave quite a void in a way, it's like they have such an influence on those around them, especially, I don't have the text of it, but like when Joshua passed away, and then the elders who were with him, like them just being there kept the Israelites kind of walking with God. And it said when they passed away, that's when the Israelites, stopped following God. It's like they didn't do what we're talking about. It's just passing things on properly to the next generation. But yeah, it is really cool, I think, that God blessed Jacob and Joseph, that they could see their, not only children and grandchildren, but great-grandchildren, and encourage them and impart God's love and God's encouragement on them. And I do think if God wanted them to be around influence them, try and reinforce, God's promises, all the way to third and fourth generation. So yeah, the first point is dreamers plant seeds of God's dream in the next generation. I would have had it written out in the next generation, but then it's quite long. But yeah, godly dreamers introduce the next generation to their Father in heaven. And I think really this is disciple making. Part of it is, I think, imparting God's dream on the next generation, but it's all tied in with making disciples. And this is something I think is super important that we're careful to do today in a New Testament kind of context, that we impart God's dream, and then, not just in a matter of discipling, but kind of showing really not just the motivation, but the heart behind it. Like, why is it so important? Why does it matter so much that we do follow God? Why do we want to follow God? It's not just a matter of commitment, but really desire to follow God. But there's several ways in the text here that found that they kind of, imparted God's dream, really kind of emphasized what God wanted to do versus through their own testimony. So from the text that I didn't include because I didn't have space, I'll read it now, but from Genesis 48, verse 3, it says, "Then Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me, and said to me, Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make you a multitude of people, and give this land to your descendants after you as an everlasting possession." And the point there is that Jacob's telling Joseph what he went through. And I'm sure Joseph knew, but Jacob really wanted to remind him, this is what God's done for me. This is how God's worked in my life. He's told me these things. And I think in many ways, Joseph would have done the same thing for his descendants because he went through so much, lost so much and gained so much. He really saw God's work in his life the whole time. And I think that alone would be such an encouragement because his descendants would see God's done this for, our great-granddad, and the promise extends to us. He's going to do great things for us too. And the second thing is dreamers plant seeds of God's dream through reminding us of God's character. So it's interesting to me that both Jacob and Joseph said basically the same thing. And he blessed Joseph and said, God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, God who has fed me all my life long to this day. Just right. He who has redeemed me from the evil, bless the lads, let my name be named upon them. Actually, I'm not sure this is right. Oh, I see what I did. Okay, all right. Yeah, that's what I meant to talk about. But God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers. So the point is that they're not so much talking about God's promises in this case, but that they're saying that God fed them. Jacob said, God fed me all those years. And both Jacob and then Joseph kind of repeated what his dad said when he was dying. God will be with you. It wasn't, it is a promise, but it's also really speaking of who God is. God loves you. He has grace. He will be with you. That's right. There's more here. Anyway, the third thing is through speaking God's promises. So that's kind of what we, similar passages we look through. God promised Abraham really, that he would bring them to the promised land, and he would make them a nation. He would work through them. And kind of on top of that, especially when you look at the prophecies that God gave through Jacob when he was blessing all of his sons, the prophecy of Jesus coming through the line of Judah, that promise is so, I think, something that they held on to all throughout, that. And the next thing that dreamers, impart on the next generation is dreamers prepare for transition. Really, they prepare not just working directly with their offspring, to continue God's dream, but they also, they're quite active and put a lot of effort into making sure that their offspring succeed well. Let's see what else. And then, but the key thing though is that the dreamers lead others through the changes that God wants to take place, even if they themselves don't always see the changes themselves. From a New Testament context, godly dreamers are focused on doing God's work, to usher in His kingdom to the world and help set up the next generation to continue the task. So, for the church, our God's dream that we're should be our dream is the Great Commission, saving lives, advancing the kingdom. And, it's really important that we bring up the next generation to continue that. Otherwise, church just ceases, kind of.
That's right. That's right.
But yeah, one story that there's something I heard a long time ago that this reminds me of is I heard of the missionary that I think it was, not sure what year it was, earlier, like maybe 1800s, I think it was, went to China, and he really wanted, he really felt led, I want to start a church in China. I mean, there's like Christianity is not even a thing there. So he spent his whole life and only converted one person. Only one person became Christian, and then that missionary died. He never got to see, a church form in China. But then that person he converted, he became a pastor and started a church. And then so the whole church in China started because of this missionary. Even though God worked through him really mightily, even though he never did get to see it in the end. But I think that wasn't something that he would have regretted, because even though he didn't get to see it, that's really not the point. And I think not the point for Jacob and Joseph. They knew they weren't going to see the promised land again, but it didn't dissuade them. They weren't like, never going to go back now. It just, you guys need to hold on that God will bring you back. So one thing that was interesting though, I noticed, first point of this is that, they prepare the way for the next generation is not just an inheritance thing and, not just encouragement, but also actively setting things up, trying to ensure success in the next generation. And so like in verse 22 of chapter 48, Jacob makes a point, moreover, I have given to you one portion above your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorite with my sword and my bow. So Jacob fought for this piece of land. I think it's part of the promised land, as far as I know. And he said, basically telling Joseph, look, I claim this for you. You just need to go get it. It's out there. And I just think that's pretty neat. And really, if you think about it, that's kind of what God has done for us too. Jesus dying on the cross.
That's right.
He paved the way and paid the price for us to be free. We just need to go claim it. Kind of inherit that. And then the next point, dreamers, they don't fear change, especially when it's God's plan. They don't, even though transition for the next generation might look quite different from their time, it's not something to be afraid of as long as it's all within God's plan. God had shown Jacob that Joseph's younger son needed the greater blessing. That was God's will, even though it was not, even though he wasn't the oldest, that was the plan.
That's right.
So we see that in verse 14, as well as verse 17 through 20. And then, we see that at first Joseph wasn't happy with that. It was like, well, that's against the tradition. That's how we do it. It's still the son. That's the order. And I do think that system, in many ways, came from God. There's a lot of patterns in the Bible for firstborn, first fruits. But it kind of reminds me of Jesus with the Sabbath. He's the Lord of the Sabbath. You know, even though it's a good and important rule, you know, it can't stand in the way of what he wants to do. You know, and in this case, he knew the hearts of Ephraim and Manasseh. He knew who needed the blessing. Okay, and then finally, and then probably the most important point, is that dreamers are mentors. And really, especially I think as they either have kids or grow old, that's kind of their number one purpose, you know, is to mentor and raise up, really make disciples of the next generation. You know, I mean, it applies to any sort of trade, I suppose. You've got to mentor up your successor. But in the case of the church, you really have to, I think, take care that they don't get off track, you know, make sure they stick to the word.
Yes.
And the thing is, too, that, you know, in being a mentor, you're not thinking about yourself or making a good name for yourself. Your focus is on the next generation, who you're teaching. You know, that's really your goal. And so it's really a selfless, loving thing, I think, to mentor the next generation. And we can see in the text how Jacob was a mentor for Joseph, you know, like with the whole thing with, you know, quote unquote wrong son getting the blessing, you know, the first Joseph was like, well, that's wrong. And then Jacob's like, no, son, you have to understand that that's not how it works. You know, sometimes God says it needs to be some other way. But also I think, you know, at the end of when Jacob was talking to Joseph, he reiterated, you know, God will be with you. God will visit you and bring you back. It's interesting, almost word for word, like Joseph seemed to really take it to heart. He said the exact same thing to his generation when he was passing away.
That's right. That's right.
But yeah, one illustration of mentorship that from Derek's notes that I thought was really cool is, you know, every man should seek to have 3 individuals in his life. They should have a Paul, a Barnabas, and a Timothy. Paul is an older man who's willing to mentor and to build into your life. Basically, really take you under their wing and teach you what God has shown them, teach you, you know, through their experience and what they lived through. And Barnabas is like a soul brother, basically, a close friend, somebody whose faith you'll want to imitate, and somebody who loves you but is not impressed by you, somebody to whom you can be accountable to. And Timothy is a younger man into whose life you are building. Paul, the quintessential mentor, building into the life of his protege, affirming, encouraging, and teaching, correcting, directing, and praying with and for him. So I think it's really a good kind of picture of the church as a whole, you know, and why it's so important that we come together as a church.
Yes.
You know, we need people not only to mentor us and to be, you know, close friends with, but really it's important that as believers we take others, you know, new believers under our wing to disciple.
That's right.
Let's see. So the first point is that mentors have to trust. Mentors must trust who they're mentoring, and in a way it is a partnership to carry on the dream from one generation to the next. It's like they're both in it together. You know, even though one is over the other, it's not really a master-servant thing. It's like the mentor wants to build up who they're mentoring, and then who they're mentoring is eager to learn, eager to become, you know, grow in Christianity, grow in Christ. And also, dreamers must trust the next generation with the dream, you know. And I think that's definitely a tricky thing, you know, like, as people, we tend to get in the whole mindset of, well, you want it done right, gotta do it yourself kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it definitely can be hard to kind of let go, you know, and trust something you care about so much
Yes.
to somebody else. But I think that's something that God calls all of us to at some point, you know that process of letting go and handing it to somebody else
Yes, yes.
is, you know, some ways kind of like handing something to God too. It's like, you know, I cared about this thing, but, you know, I'm clinging to it and give it to God. Another thing is that to mentor another requires being open to them and genuine. You know, trust must go both ways. It's really friendship, you know, it's not, you know, really good mentorship relationship isn't rigid. It's not like professor and student. It's really more than that, you know, especially when it comes to discipleship. And also we must trust that God will have his hand on the people in every generation. That
That's right.
God will be the person we're mentoring. You know, I mean, a friend I know online, he's, you know, he's a Christian, but he's struggled with so many things, you know, following God and trusting. And, you know, I can encourage him as much as I can, but sometimes really the best thing is to pray and just trust that God, you know, God will not abandon you.
Yes.
So, it's just hard to do sometimes, but it's working. And the second thing is mentors encourage. Godly mentors encourage the next generation to move into what God has for them, even if their current situation is either too comfortable or just, or even uncomfortable. You know, they might have trouble either wanting to move out of, say, a comfortable situation. Because if you think about it, the Israelites at that point, they were actually in a pretty good place. You know, they were in the land of Goshen, which was like one of the few places in Egypt that had pastures and stuff.
That's right.
And they were probably thinking, well, this is kind of like the promised land. Why do we need to leave? You know, even though Joseph and Jacob keep saying, God will bring you back, you know. But also I think it's, people have a tendency to have, you know, hardship in life. And then it's like, well, why should we trust God and move with God forward? You know, it's like, why isn't he blessing me now? If that makes any sense. You know, it's kind of the thing where, you know, in some situations, it's just kind of lack faith because it seems like God's not working. You know, I would suspect that's kind of how the Israelites felt once Pharaoh got hard on them and, you know, brought them into slavery. It's like, well, where's God now? Like, you know, they kind of, I kind of wish I had brought that text in here when they doubted Moses. You know, it's like, well, who cares if God's saying, you know, we're stuck here. You know, and now Pharaoh made things harder for us. You know,
That's right.
but yeah, it wasn't God's plan for them to stay in Egypt. They needed to be encouraged that it would be better for them to follow God to the promised land. Godly mentors also encourage the next generation that, you know, even when moving forward looks too challenging or dangerous, you know, especially this comes out when they're with Moses in the wilderness. You know, they're like, oh, we want to go back. We don't want to keep following God. And Moses really needed to remind them, remember what it was like back there. It was bad. You know, it might be hard now, but it's not, you know, it's not worse than what slavery was. And then third thing that his mentors teach, which I know is a bit obvious, but the thing is with mentors is someone who teaches by demonstration, you know, one who walks alongside and shows you how to go about life. You know, they're not just, you know, it's not just classroom and then, you know, they tell you what to do. They really live life with you. You know, that's kind of I think what Joseph did, you know, with his kids probably. Jacob taught Joseph that sometimes God's plan will supersede the traditions of men, as we saw with his blessing over Joseph's sons. You know, the mentors teach them the skills of believing and serving God. You know, kind of a thing that, it's one thing to read about it in the Bible, but to see somebody really following God, especially when it gets hard, I think it's something that we as believers really need, it really helps to have somebody who's been through the fire, and seen what God can do,
Yes.
And finally, probably the most important thing, is mentors pray. Mentors pray for those that are mentoring for so many reasons. To show a new believer how they can boldly pray to the Father is a precious and important thing. They pray, even when they're not around those they're mentoring. But I think it kind of reminds me of when Jesus told his disciples how to pray, that skill is so important as growing as a believer. That it's really something that we need to practice and grow in a way. I remember growing up, kind of my dad encouraging me, not to, prayer isn't just a laundry list or anything, it really is talking to God. And then, Jacob prayed for Joseph's sons, asking for God's blessing and will to be done in their lives, asking God to bestow on them the dream that God had for him to his descendants. I do think it is pretty cool that it says, God, for whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac fought, God who has fed me all my day long to this day. The angel who has redeemed me from all evil. Bless the lads, let my name be named upon them.
Yes.
He knew really personally the significance of promises God gave to Abraham and Isaac. He's the one that wrestled with God. He really went through it. And I think it's really cool that he kind of went to that level. It's like these two sons of Joseph, they're like, put them in the same caliber as what God gave me. I think that's really cool. So yeah, any other thoughts? I went through real fast.
That last point, because that was one of the things I underlined, the angel who had redeemed me from evil. That redemption that shows up over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Even in the Old Testament, the foreshadowing the redemption that Jesus would give us later.
Yeah.
It's just amazing.
And I like to think that 400 years later, when God's people was experiencing a nightmare as slaves, that they remembered a slave 400 years before them.
Yeah.
That taught them how to trust God and to cry out to God. And what a wonderful example Joseph was to that generation. That
Yeah.
God would lead them out of slavery into
Yeah, and I kind of wonder if that really impressed on them the importance of trusting God's timing, because it talks about how they were so numerous that the Egyptians of all people were afraid that they'd get overthrown. The Egyptians were like the superpower at the time,
That's right.
and had even despite being enslaved and everything, had the Israelites really banded together and like, we're done with this, they really could have short-circuited in a way what God was doing. But instead they're like, well, God said he'll lead us out, he'll be with us, And then I think, even though they doubted Moses at first, they realized this is it, especially as the plague started happening, like, this is God here,
That's right.
Okay, well, that's pretty much everything I had to say. I think, as we close this study on Joseph, just think about, kind of compare your life to his, how's God worked in your life, kind of same way as Joseph's, or how not, And I think definitely keep in mind kind of the heart of Joseph, that he, no matter what, trusted God, could be there, even when he got left in the prison. That would have been hard.
Yes.
But yeah, thank you all for coming out and listening.
Great
Sorry,
job,
I was a
James,
little bit-
great job.
Merry Christmas, everyone.
Thanks, James, we appreciate it.